So how did we start with this risk stratification problem? So if you look at the consensus document for VT ablation back in 2009, there was essentially no recommendation on how to manage patients with advanced heart failure. The only thing that was recommended here to pay attention to fluid management during the procedure, but there was really no recommendation because there was no evidence essentially how to stratify patients pre-procedure for risk of heart failure. This is just an example, a 67-year-old with advanced non-ischemic cardiomyopathy, very low ejection fraction, presenting with VT storm, 67 SED shocks over 1 month. Ablation was attempted, aborted because of incessant VT during the procedure and cardiogenic shock, and therefore was transferred in incessant VT despite lidocaine, amiodarone, intubation, and sedation. It's clear that mapping sinus rhythm here and reconstructing the scar in sinus rhythm is essentially not feasible, not possible. We looked at 193 patients with scar-related VT, and we just looked at two endpoints essentially. First one was a cardiogenic shock or periprocedural AHD, we call it acute hemodynamic decompensation. That was defined as a sustained hypotension with a blood pressure systolic less than 80 to 90 millimeters of mercury, despite increasing doses of vasopressors and requiring two things. You either stop the procedure early so you don't get the job done, or you have to bail them out with some form of mechanical support like intra-aortic balloon pump or Impella. And the secondary endpoint was all-cause mortality after follow-up. And if you look at the tertiles of score here, essentially you'll see that there is a clear increase in the incidence of acute hemodynamic decompensation with increased tertiles. The first tertile, less than 10 points, second one between 10 and 16 points, and the third tertile is of 25% risk of decompensation if the PAINS-D score was greater than 17 points. So based on this, we thought that we could use potentially this score to stratify patients at high risk of decompensation. And another important aspect that I want to show you here is that if we look back at the data from our paper here, the majority, 63% of patients, the episode of acute decompensation happened during substrate ablation and not during VT induction for mapping, which was an interesting finding. And we put together this registry together with the IVTCC, 12 centers essentially in the United States, high volume centers for VT ablation, 2,061 patients with scar-related VT across 12 institutions in the US. And here we didn't have really data from acute decompensation, so we used as a proxy early mortality post-procedure, 30-day mortality. And here what we found, first of all, that the incidence of early mortality post-VT ablation is 5% at 30 days. Just to give you an example, the mortality of a combined valve surgery and CABG is way below 3%. So a message I want to give to everybody that the VT ablation is really a fairly high-risk procedure, essentially, probably the highest risk procedure that we do in cardiology and potentially also CT surgery. On the left side, you can see freedom from death and transplant after the procedure with the Seattle heart failure model on the left side and the PAINS-D score on the right side. These are tertiles of score. And it's clear again that the third tertile of PAINS-D score or Seattle heart failure model score classified patients at extremely high risk, significantly high risk actually, of adverse post-procedural outcomes compared to the first and second tertile. So this is the higher risk group. So after this, the guidelines were updated in 2019, and now there is a statement that says that the PAINS-D score and the Seattle heart failure model were recommended for pre-procedural risk stratification in patients with structural heart disease undergoing VT ablation. So for patients with biventricular failure and high PAINS-D score, the question is, can we do anything to improve outcomes in this group? And we designed this pilot study, was the last thing I've done before moving to Cleveland Clinic from Penn, where we essentially created an institutional workflow on how to deal with these patients. So the step one was essentially admit this patient to the ICU under the care of heart failure colleagues for hemodynamic optimization, inotropic support when necessary, but mostly to assess for candidacy for advanced therapies, LVAD and transplant. CT surgery then walked in and implanted the VECMO prophylactically before the decompensation happened. So we evaluated for vascular access sites like CTA and ultrasound, and we have elective initiation of ECMO, either from the femoral artery to femoral vein, or in patients with PAD, we went from the axillary artery to the femoral vein. And then we went for procedure ablation. It was catheter ablation targeting all the possible inducible VTs and complete elimination of the electrograms within the substrate. In select group, we repeated NIPS from the defibrillator, invasive stimulation the next day, while still on ECMO, to decide for reablation, because before with the cannula, we really want to make sure that there is no residual VT to the best of our knowledge. And with this approach here, our institutional 30-day mortality dropped from a historical 76% down to 11%. Of course, this is only a pilot study. It needs to be replicated, and mostly we really need a randomized clinical trial to prove this. So essentially, all patients with a PANSD score greater than 17 and an ejection fraction less than 30%, this will trigger heart failure consult as an outpatient. By inpatients, of course, they will be seen by heart failure, and they will evaluate whether they're candidate for advanced therapies options. And in these patients, hemodynamic support is considered. However, if patients have a PANSD score greater than 17 and ejection fraction less than 30% with no advanced therapy options, and there are a significant subgroup of patients like that, then we discuss collegially whether we should even do the case. We discuss with families, and in some patients, actually, we don't take them to the lab because the family doesn't want to expose them to potential high risk of complications. And this will be interesting because we're introducing now palliative medicine in the, as essentially a strategy for these patients. And a few years from now, we will compare essentially patients that we didn't do the ablation to the ones that we ended up doing some form of rescue intervention. And I will be shocked in a negative or positive way, depending whether the outcomes will be any different between the two groups. And that will be something that is in the works, but I think we need data on that.